Today we'll discuss which country possessed the best army during the Second World War.
I know these topics in the best and worst category are highly controversial. For this episode, perhaps we should focus on ground forces to simplify things?
Yes, that definitely makes the whole issue much easier. What does it actually mean for an army to be the best? Was the best army of World War II the one that won the war? Although no single army won this war alone. But on the other hand, you could argue that the best army of World War II was the Wehrmacht, because it took the mobilization of all the world's greatest powers to defeat it. And there's also the Japanese army, which, after all, conquered a substantial part of Asia. That also requires a certain proficiency. So, I don't know how to classify what best truly means in your view.
Well, as you mentioned, the question of which army was the best in World War II, probably the easiest answer is, it depends. Traditionally, there are no easy answers to such lofty questions. We need to consider the criteria for evaluating an army. So, I'll put it this way. The best army of World War II is one that has the best support infrastructure, the greatest industrial potential. Consequently, first, it doesn't suffer from shortages of ammunition or fuel. It has enough to properly train its soldiers first, and then properly supply them on the battlefield. It has efficient enough logistics and an industrial system to constantly replenish losses and develop its armed forces, including technologically, thus continuing to modernize. War is a system. The best army has the best system.
Is the Red Army what we're talking about right now?
No, the Red Army absolutely does not qualify as the best army of World War II. The capabilities of armies in 1939 were vastly different from those in 1945. Consider the American Army. A rather weak and numerically small force in 1939, it transformed into arguably the most effective land army by 1945. Its strength lying in its efficiency, not just its size. The German Heer was undoubtedly the top land army in terms of effectiveness and efficiency in 1939, demonstrated by their early victories. However, Germany's military was more like a sprinter than a marathon runner, and World War II turned out to be a marathon. As a result, their initial advantages faded as their industrial limitations hindered their ability to adequately replenish their forces, maintain training standards, and continuously modernize in the face of an ongoing arms race.
Why did Germany possess the world's leading land forces in 1939?
The answer lies mainly in their doctrine, tactics, and operational art. Critically, their command structure excelled in speed and efficiency at both tactical and operational levels. This translated into superior operational flexibility, an approach that would later be adopted globally.
What was a key characteristic that made the American army the most powerful at the end of World War II?
The most powerful army at the end of the war was the American one, and its strength came mainly from having far more resources than anyone else. Their approach was to defeat the enemy through sheer firepower, something they could achieve because the USA's industrial capacity and supply system were unmatched in their ability to provide shells and maintain supply lines. The Red Army's primary characteristic was the endurance and tenacity of its soldiers, who remained tough opponents even with poor supplies. This resilience evolved during the war. Mass surrenders common in 1941 largely stopped from 1942 onwards. Their perseverance was notable. Once dug in, Red Army soldiers were incredibly difficult to defeat due to their rapid entrenchment and staunch defensive capabilities. Their resilience and endurance are key defining traits. Germany's eventual downfall was partly rooted in the success of its own military innovation. While their tactical and operational art was initially superior, contrasting sharply with the Red Army's weakness in this area until 1943, its very effectiveness led to imitation. Adversaries observed and adopted Germany's flexible methods from the platoon level up. Since Germany's advantage wasn't based on numbers or materiel, but on these novel tactics, their replication by others nullified Germany's key strength. As combat doctrines homogenized, the war increasingly favored the side with greater numerical and material resources, contributing to Germany's losses. The effectiveness of armed forces depends on the efficiency of the state, on the efficiency of the rear support. Even an army that suffers many defeats but has a good support base will be able to recover. And very importantly, despite these defeats, If the support infrastructure, the rear, is maintained, such an army will learn from its mistakes.
A testament to other factors, perhaps, the Red Army often achieved victories, even when its early support infrastructure failed. It wasn't uncommon for offensive units to lack sufficient fuel and ammunition, highlighting the challenges they overcame.
The Red Army's victory over Germany should primarily be attributed to the weakening of its opponent, not to its own inherent superiority. The Soviet military wasn't exceptionally modern or effective. In fact, it lagged technologically behind the German, American, and British armies in many areas, such as communications and artillery fire control. Soviet success stemmed from two main factors: the massive deployment of resources and, crucially, the serious degradation of the German army beginning in 1943. Thus, while the Red Army ultimately entered Berlin, this victory was largely possible because the Germans eventually lacked the necessary ammunition and fuel to effectively counter them. Yet scrutinizing the Red Army's campaigns closely reveals an organization wrestling with quite severe logistical shortcomings. Indeed, were it not for the vital support rendered through Lend-Lease, notably the provision of numerous American trucks, along with fuel and even food for its troops, the Red Army's operational capacity would have been drastically curtailed. Absent the United States and UK's assistance, the Soviet military's performance during World War II would certainly have been far less impactful. Even throughout 1944 and 1945, Soviet triumphs demanded a staggering toll in human lives and materiel. It is this immense expenditure that fuels debate regarding its actual combat effectiveness and overall efficiency. For instance, consider a major success like Operation Bagration, unquestionably a significant operational triumph over the Germans. Yet, when closely examining the casualties the Soviets suffered to secure this win, one finds that the losses in killed and wounded were remarkably similar for both victor and vanquished. Consequently, had the Germans possessed greater strength and the means to contest the battle on a more level playing field, which they demonstrably lacked, this particular victory fundamentally might well have been unattainable for the Soviets. From 1942, Germany had, in practical terms, ceded the operational momentum on numerous stretches of the Eastern Front, like the approaches to Moscow to the Red Army. Yet, the Soviets required nearly 2 full years before they could start achieving clear victories in that specific area. Similarly, it demanded over a year before successes materialized, for instance, along the Ukrainian front. This slow progress also illustrates that the Red Army needed to fundamentally reconstitute its capabilities, supported in part by Anglo-American aid, while simultaneously exploiting its opponent's vulnerabilities. Notably, from 1942 forward, the Germans struggled with massive supply difficulties and were unable to regenerate their military power to its earlier effectiveness. As a result, the standard of their officer corps diminished. The competence of their soldiers lessened. Formations possessed reduced amounts of equipment, and recruits received inferior training, among other issues. Comparing distinct forces can be like judging apples against bananas when trying to pinpoint the world's best army. In 1941, the German military possessed a clear advantage over the Red Army regarding training, tactical proficiency, and operational art. This difference started closing by 1943, stemming partially from the Red Army's growing effectiveness and partially from the German Army's qualitative erosion. German military leadership, it appears, judged that the Soviets never completely mastered the adept handling of large armored formations, even by 1945. While evidence can be marshaled both for and against this view, the reality is that Soviet command of such formations reached its zenith in 1944 to 45, considering 1941 as the nadir. Critically, however, the Red Army did not face a truly stern examination in 1945. That is, the German forces were by then so diminished they couldn't mount a substantial challenge. Meaning, if the German army of 1945 had retained even the capabilities it held, for example, in 1943, then those powerful Red Army armored thrusts could very possibly have ended in failure, echoing earlier engagements.
What about the British? It's key to remember that during World War II, Britain functioned as a sprawling, international empire. As a consequence, a significant number of its divisions originated from across its global territories, with Indian formations being a notable example.
When discussing the British Army, One must account for the inclusion of independent Commonwealth nations, Australian and New Zealand divisions, South African contingents, and Canadian troops fought alongside the British themselves, English, Scots, Irish, Welsh. Furthermore, the substantial Indian Army was integral. This meant units varied. New Zealand formations had their own flavor, as did the Canadians, who, if comparisons must be made, were frequently considered among the most tenacious combatants. However, evaluating the British Army overall proves complex precisely because of this diversity. Yet, perhaps its most defining trait was its consistency between 1939 and 1945. As early as 1939, the forces designated for Europe, distinct from the wider empire, were essentially fully mechanized. This organizational standard was largely upheld throughout, evident in the Italian campaign commencing in 1943, and later during the 1944-45 push through France into Germany. Britain's army certainly ranks among the premier forces of World War II. Nonetheless, a considerable and genuine weakness was its procedural rigidity, an inflexible adherence to predetermined plans, especially noticeable within the higher command structure. This tendency somewhat clouds the overall evaluation of British military performance. It's arguable that this very schematicism occasionally hampered the Army's potential effectiveness on the battlefield. Despite this, it was undeniably a powerful entity. The British deployed formidable armed forces. Much like their American allies, by 1944-45, this army boasted extraordinarily efficient logistics. The very framework of the British military allowed for rapid recovery. Consider the Polish 1st Armored Division under General Maxek during the Battle of Falaise in early August 1944. Its relevance stems from operating entirely under British protocols, being organized and trained to their standards. The battle's opening stages were challenging for the Polish tankers, resulting in substantial losses. Yet the British system, specifically its replacement structure, enabled rear support elements to provide the division with virtually a complete replacement set of tanks within just 24 to 48 hours. This inherent resilience meant combat readiness could be almost instantly reconstituted after a setback. That capability was extraordinary. Approximately 2/3 of all combat deaths in both world wars resulted from artillery barrages, reflecting a fundamental truth established since the Napoleonic era. Major battles are ultimately determined by artillery power, not by soldiers engaging with bayonets or rifles. A single, telling statistic underscores how the British and American armies embodied this by 1944. They employed more artillery specialists than frontline infantrymen. Possessing a greater number of artillery personnel than infantry signifies an enormous capacity for firepower, coupled with vast reserves of ordnance. This is why, by 1944, the British Army, much like the American forces, represented the peak of modern military organization globally. And yes, for both, the ordinary statistical soldier had no ammo problem. Therefore, we encounter a dynamic where fielding modern artillery, employing a sophisticated system for fire direction, having superior communications, deploying numerous guns, and possessing almost boundless ammunition supplies effectively secures victory beforehand. By 1944, no military force on Earth could realistically engage and win a major confrontation against the American or British armies. The Red Army lacked this capacity. Germany's failure boiled down fundamentally to the absence of the vast quantities of ammunition and fuel essential just to compete on level terms with their adversaries. Consider the reality of 1945. The Red Army entered Berlin using American trucks, powered by American gasoline, and fielding some American tanks. This reliance highlights the underlying inefficiency of the Soviet war machine, even though it commanded a considerable, even very large number of artillery pieces and tanks. Consequently, a hypothetical 1945 confrontation between the American and Red armies would likely have been a shock for the Russians comparable to the 1941 Wehrmacht encounter. If the Soviets had attempted to fight the Americans on land as they had the Germans, a swift and terrible catastrophe would likely have ensued, given American advantages in technology, air power, ammunition, and fuel, allowing for rapid destruction of Soviet forces.
Could you provide some numbers regarding Lend-Lease vehicles received by the Soviets?
Lend-Lease trucks constituted roughly 60 to 70% of the total number of new trucks available to the Soviets during the war. By 1945, they likely formed a majority, perhaps over two-thirds, of the Red Army's operational truck fleet, utterly crucial for logistics, artillery towing, and troop transport. It's also worth noting that while many famous Katyusha rocket launchers, especially later in the war, were mounted on Lend-Lease Studebaker US-6 trucks, thanks to trucks provided by Allied forces, Soviet troops could often outrun retreating Germans. Just imagine what immense industrial power was required not only to equip your own army, but also supply the Soviets, the British, and the Chinese. A fundamental contrast emerges when examining the American Army of 1944 to 1945. Its philosophy of war differed significantly. This wasn't about bravery. American infantry, tankers, and the famed Marines in the Pacific certainly fought courageously, and ultimately, infantry must seize ground. The core divergence lay elsewhere. For an American commander, the inherent value placed on his soldiers' lives was distinct from that of his German counterpart. It was natural for an American officer to avoid exposing his troops if not absolutely essential, whereas a German commander, seeking battle, factored in the anticipated loss of his men more readily. The famous maxim often attributed to Patton: "No bastard ever won a war by dying for his country. He won it by making the other poor dumb bastard die for his country," perfectly encapsulates this guiding principle. This philosophy manifested directly on the battlefield. The American Army was built upon crushing material superiority and overwhelming firepower. Faced with resistance during an attack in 1945, an American commander, at battalion, regiment, or division level, wouldn't typically react like a German commander in 1941 or 1943, who might instinctively opt for fire and maneuver to engage directly. The American approach leaned towards halt upon encountering resistance, assess and neutralize the threat primarily through firepower, minimizing risk to personnel. Unleash a massive artillery barrage. By 1945, American artillery was arguably the world's most potent, alongside the highly effective British, and potentially call in air support. Only after significantly degrading the enemy's capacity to resist through this sheer weight of fire would the advance resume to overrun or finish off the opposition. They possessed the capability to not accept an immediate, direct fight if a less costly alternative existed. This preference for firepower didn't imply an inability to fight fiercely when necessary. The Battle of the Bulge in the Ardennes, December 1944, provides perhaps the clearest example. Despite the German offensive achieving surprise and initial gains, though hampered by Germany's overall weakness by then, American troops demonstrated they could fight fanatically and effectively under duress. But the underlying principle remained. If the enemy could be defeated without significant risk to American lives through the application of overwhelming material force, that was the preferred logical path. This represents a massive difference in operational thinking compared to adversaries who relied more heavily on maneuver and accepted higher casualties as inherent to combat.
True, by 1945, the USA was a superpower with unmatched might. But in 1941, it suffered defeats at the hands of the Japanese.
In my assessment, if we understand armed forces as integrated systems, and we must, the Japanese Army was one of the worst major military organizations of the war. Examining it holistically reveals it simply doesn't compare favorably. It operated in a lower league regarding equipment and combat tactics, often employing subpar weaponry. Critically, its logistical support was generally nightmarish, and its medical system atrocious. To be an enlisted infantry soldier meant facing a staggering probability of death around 90%. It functioned, in a sense, as an army of suicides, not merely due to banzai charges, but because operations were sometimes launched with no provision for supply. The apparent assumption was soldiers would either perish or capture necessities. Effectively, capture what you need or starve. Of course, they achieved a string of initial successes, but this primarily occurred against opponents who were initially weaker, poorly prepared, or spread too thin. Furthermore, The Japanese army itself was concentrated and ready for its opening campaigns when it attacked the British and Americans in 1941. Consequently, those first months yielded significant victories against adversaries often not fully prepared, like in the Dutch East Indies or the Philippines. The American army, for instance, was still gearing up, learning as it went. It lost the initial battle for the Philippines, prompting General MacArthur's famous promise to return, a promise fulfilled by a vastly different, more powerful U.S. Army, the kind previously discussed. Therefore, we certainly cannot claim the U.S. Army was the world's best in 1941. It simply wasn't yet. Meanwhile, the Japanese experienced their 5 minutes of fame, an initial successful period lasting about half a year. This aligns somewhat with Admiral Yamamoto's prediction of running wild for 6 months to a year before his capabilities waned. In reality, Japan's offensive potential was largely spent within 6 months, arguably a year at most. The Guadalcanal campaign clearly illustrated that when the adversary dictated battle conditions, the Japanese system struggled profoundly to cope effectively.
So, determining the single best army of World War II remains complex, heavily dependent on the specific time frame and criteria prioritized. While the German Wehrmacht displayed unmatched tactical and operational prowess early on, its brilliance proved unsustainable against the war's marathon demands, hampered by industrial limitations and eventual qualitative decline. The Red Army, characterized by immense resilience and numbers, ultimately prevailed on the Eastern Front, yet did so with staggering losses, significant inefficiencies, and critical reliance on Allied Lend-Lease for mobility and logistics. The British Army, consistent and backed by a global empire and strong late-war logistics, played a crucial role, while the Japanese Army, despite initial shocking successes against unprepared opponents, suffered from fundamental systemic flaws, particularly in logistics. By 1944 to 45, the American Army emerged as arguably the most potent system, built upon unparalleled industrial might, overwhelming firepower, sophisticated logistics, and a doctrine consciously aimed at minimizing its own casualties, effectively representing the peak of sustainable, modern military organization by the war's conclusion. Ultimately, the best army wasn't just about initial battlefield victories, but about the comprehensive national system supporting it, a system best exemplified by the conflict's end by the United States. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the complexities of World War II armies, please show your support by liking this episode and subscribing to our podcast so you don't miss future discussions. For more fascinating historical insights and interesting facts delivered in a quick, bite-sized format, be sure to follow us on our social media channels. You can find the links in the description below. Thanks for listening.